The streets of New York City, 1959. A delegation of Soviet officials stands frozen on the corner of Times Square, their eyes wide with disbelief. Above them, towering neon advertisements pulse with vibrant colors. Coca-Cola, Camel cigarettes, Broadway shows, each one larger and more dazzling than the last. Their guide, a State Department official, watches with amusement as one Soviet delegate finally breaks the stunned silence. "Is this what you call propaganda?" he asks, genuinely confused. "No," replies the American. "We call it advertising." Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now let's get to the story. This moment captures one of the most fascinating psychological confrontations of the Cold War. The collision between Soviet citizens raised in a planned economy devoid of commercial advertising and the kaleidoscopic consumer wonderland of post-war America. It was more than a mere culture shock. It was a fundamental challenge to everything they had been taught about capitalism and Western society. The Cold War is often recounted through the dramatic lens of espionage, nuclear brinkmanship, and proxy conflicts. But perhaps the most profound battleground existed in the minds of ordinary citizens, how they perceived the opposing system and its values. For Soviets, nothing symbolized this clash more viscerally than American advertising, colorful, omnipresent, and unapologetically capitalistic. By the mid-1950s, the United States had emerged from World War II not just as a military superpower, but as the world's most advanced consumer society. While Europeans were still rebuilding from wartime devastation and Soviets continued to live under strict rationing, Americans were experiencing unprecedented prosperity. The gross national product had jumped from $200 billion in 1940 to $300 billion by 1950, and personal income had risen by 60% in real terms since before the war. This prosperity manifested visually across the American landscape. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles became canvases for an explosion of commercial messaging. Times Square alone featured over 20 million watts of electricity dedicated purely to advertisements by 1960. The spectacular, enormous animated neon billboards became iconic symbols of American modernity and abundance. Meanwhile, behind the Iron Curtain, Soviet citizens lived in a starkly different visual landscape. Their cities were dominated by political messaging, red banners proclaiming production goals, portraits of party leaders, and ideological slogans about the virtues of labor and sacrifice for the collective. Commercial advertising, in the Western sense, was almost entirely absent. The only advertisements I ever saw in Moscow before 1956 were occasional signs indicating what was sold in a shop. Bread or shoes, nothing more, recalled Mikhail Borodin, a Soviet journalist who would later visit the United States as part of a cultural exchange. They were informational, not persuasive. The idea that someone would try to convince you to buy one product over another seemed absurd. There was usually only one option available anyway. This stark contrast reflected the fundamentally different economic philosophies of the two superpowers. The American economy was driven by consumption. Its advertising industry existed to stimulate desire and create demand. The Soviet planned economy, by contrast, focused on production. Goods were allocated rather than marketed, distributed according to centralized planning rather than consumer choice. When the first major Soviet delegations began visiting the United States following Stalin's death in 1953, this distinction became a source of profound disorientation for many visitors. Nikita Khrushchev's thaw had opened limited opportunities for cultural exchange, and suddenly Soviet officials, journalists, and cultural figures found themselves transported into America's commercial wonderland. For many, the experience was overwhelming. Viktor Sukhodrev, who would later become Khrushchev's personal interpreter, described his first visit to an American supermarket in 1956. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The shelves were full, not just with one type of each product, but dozens, and everything packaged in bright colors with pictures and slogans. In Moscow, butter came wrapped in plain paper. Here it had colorful prints and brand names. It seemed wasteful, even decadent." This sensory overload was carefully documented by Soviet handlers, who worried about the psychological impact on their citizens. A 1957 memo from the Soviet embassy in Washington warned, "Exposure to American commercial culture presents significant ideological hazards. The visual saturation of advertising creates an impression of abundance that may distort our comrades' understanding of capitalist reality." Indeed, Soviet propaganda had long portrayed American society as one of stark inequality, a small elite enjoying luxury while masses suffered in poverty. The ubiquitous advertisements, which seemed to address everyone as a potential consumer, complicated this narrative. If capitalism produced such scarcity and inequality, why were advertisements for luxury goods aimed at ordinary citizens? The answer, according to official Soviet interpretation, was simple. Advertising was a form of manipulation designed to create artificial needs and distract workers from their exploitation. A 1958 article in Pravda described American advertising as psychological warfare against the worker's wallet, claiming that the capitalist first steals from the worker as a producer, paying him less than the value of his labor, then robs him again as a consumer by manipulating him to buy overpriced, unnecessary goods. This interpretation was reinforced by the testimonies of loyal Soviet visitors who returned with critical reports. "The Americans have made consumption into a religion," wrote poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko after his first U.S. tour. "Their advertisements are like icons, worshipped in the cathedral of capitalism." Yet beneath such ideological pronouncements, many Soviets privately harbored a fascination with American consumer culture. The colorful advertisements, even when viewed critically, offered a glimpse into a world of material possibilities that seemed almost fantastical compared to Soviet reality. This fascination became particularly acute among younger Soviets. By the late 1950s, a generation was coming of age that had no memory of the deprivations of World War II and less patience for revolutionary asceticism. They began to question why, if socialism was truly superior, their material conditions lagged so visibly behind the West. American intelligence agencies recognized this vulnerability. A 1959 CIA assessment noted, "The material gap between Soviet promises and Soviet reality creates an exploitable weakness, particularly among youth. Consumer goods and their visualization through advertising represent a potent weapon in the battle for hearts and minds." The Eisenhower administration agreed. In 1959, they organized the American National Exhibition in Moscow's Sokolniki Park, a showcase of American consumer culture that would dramatically escalate the psychological aspect of the Cold War. The exhibition was a sensory bombardment of American abundance, featuring a full-scale model home filled with the latest appliances, fashion shows, color television demonstrations, and, most provocatively, enormous photographic displays of American supermarkets, department stores, and suburban homes. Every aspect was deliberately designed to contrast with Soviet material conditions. The Soviet leadership recognized the threat. As the exhibition was being constructed, First Deputy Premier Frol Kozlov inspected the site and reportedly exclaimed, "This is not an exhibition, it's ideological diversion. You're showing ordinary items as if they're available to average Americans." His concern was justified. When the exhibition opened on July 24, 1959, Soviet citizens flooded in at a rate of approximately 20,000 per day. Many waited in line for hours, braving official disapproval to glimpse this window into American life. The reaction was a mixture of disbelief, envy, and skepticism. Some visitors insisted the products must be prototypes unavailable to regular citizens, recalled Gilbert Robinson, one of the exhibition organizers. Others would look under tables trying to find hidden mechanisms in the appliances, convinced they couldn't possibly work as demonstrated. The most famous moment of the exhibition came when Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev toured the model American kitchen. In what became known as the kitchen debate, Nixon extolled the virtues of American consumer goods, while Khrushchev countered that such items were gadgets designed to squeeze money from consumers. Yet even as Khrushchev publicly dismissed American consumerism, he seemed fascinated by it. During his subsequent two-week tour of the United States in September 1959, he displayed a childlike wonder at American supermarkets, department stores, and suburban developments. At one point, he spontaneously stopped his motorcade to speak with shoppers at a supermarket in San Francisco, peppered them with questions about prices and shopping habits. "How often do you buy a new car?" he asked one bewildered housewife, struggling to comprehend the cycle of consumption that drove the American economy. Behind this curiosity lay a growing recognition among Soviet leadership that they were falling behind in what Khrushchev had boldly proclaimed would be an economic competition, not a military one. In a famous 1956 speech, he had declared, "We will bury you, not through war, but by demonstrating socialism's economic superiority." The American exhibition suggested this might be more difficult than anticipated. In its wake, Khrushchev launched a series of ambitious promises about Soviet consumer production. At the 21st Party Congress in 1959, he proclaimed that the USSR would overtake America in per capita production of meat, milk, and butter within 3 years, and in industrial goods by 1970. These promises reflected a significant shift in Soviet priorities. If the revolution's early decades had emphasized sacrifice for industrialization and Stalin had focused on military power, Khrushchev now recognized that regime legitimacy increasingly depended on delivering material benefits to ordinary citizens. This shift inevitably impacted Soviet attitudes toward advertising. If consumer goods were to become more central to the Soviet experience, perhaps there was something to learn from American techniques of marketing and distribution. In 1960, the Soviet Ministry of Trade established an experimental Institute for Market Research to study consumer preferences and develop more appealing packaging and presentation for Soviet goods. While still rejecting the manipulative aspects of Western advertising, Soviet officials began to acknowledge that even socialist products needed to attract consumers. This modest ideological concession opened the door to the first modern advertising in the Soviet Union. By the early 1960s, limited commercial messaging began appearing in Soviet publications and on Moscow billboards. These advertisements maintained a distinctly Soviet character, emphasizing the rational benefits of products rather than emotional appeals, but they represented a remarkable evolution. "Buy Soviet watches, precise, durable, reliable," proclaimed one early ad in Pravda, featuring a simple line drawing of a wristwatch. The accompanying text explained how Soviet watchmaking technology demonstrated socialist industrial prowess, carefully avoiding any suggestion of status or fashion that might characterize Western watch advertising. Similarly, a 1962 billboard in Leningrad advertised the ZIL refrigerator as an economical household assistant, focusing on its technical specifications and energy efficiency rather than lifestyle benefits. The visual style remained utilitarian, with technical drawings rather than the lifestyle photography that dominated Western advertising. Yet even these modest steps toward commercial communication generated ideological tension. Conservative elements within the party criticized any adoption of bourgeois marketing techniques as a dangerous compromise with capitalism. A 1963 editorial in the theoretical journal Communist warned, "We must not confuse meeting genuine consumer needs with creating artificial ones. Socialist trade serves the people. Capitalist advertising exploits them." The debate reflected a deeper uncertainty about Soviet identity in a world where the material promises of capitalism seemed increasingly difficult to dismiss. If the revolution had once offered an alternative vision of modernity based on collective values rather than individual consumption, how could this vision be maintained when the regime itself now promised consumer abundance? This question became particularly acute as Western popular culture began filtering through the Iron Curtain. Despite official restrictions, young Soviets increasingly gained access to Western music, films, and fashion, often through cultural exchanges, black markets, or radio broadcasts. Each artifact carried with it the visual language of Western advertising and consumption. The iconic Marlboro Man, Coca-Cola's distinctive logo, and characters from American film became recognized symbols, even among Soviets who had never visited the West. These images carried a powerful subtext. They represented not just products, but an entire lifestyle characterized by individual choice, pleasure, and material comfort. "We didn't just want the jeans or the cigarettes," recalled Vladimir Posner, who grew up in the Soviet Union during this period. "We wanted what they symbolized: freedom, youth, rebellion." When you see an advertisement showing young people enjoying themselves, drinking Coca-Cola, wearing fashionable clothes, driving convertibles, it creates a world you want to inhabit. Soviet authorities recognized this danger. A 1964 KGB report warned that the fetishization of Western consumer goods among Soviet youth represents a serious ideological threat. These items serve as vehicles for bourgeois values and individualistic mindsets incompatible with socialist consciousness. The regime responded with a two-pronged approach: intensified ideological education about the emptiness of capitalist materialism, combined with accelerated efforts to produce Soviet versions of popular Western goods. By the mid-1960s, Soviet factories were producing jeans, tape recorders, and electric guitars in an attempt to satisfy youth demand without resorting to Western imports. This strategy faced significant challenges. Soviet consumer goods typically lagged behind Western standards in design and quality, further reinforcing the perception of socialist inferiority. As one popular joke of the period went, "What is the difference between capitalism and socialism? Under capitalism, man exploits man. Under socialism, it's the other way around." Meanwhile, Soviet citizens with access to Western goods, diplomats, elite athletes, cultural figures allowed to travel abroad, formed a privileged class defined partly by their possession of foreign products. The special shops, berezkas, where these items could be purchased using foreign currency, became symbols of hypocrisy in a supposedly egalitarian system. This contradiction became particularly visible during the 1967 World Youth Festival in Moscow, when thousands of young visitors from around the world descended on the Soviet capital. Despite careful screening, the festival became a massive exchange of Western goods, music, and fashion. Young Soviets traded anything they could: medals, badges, even military souvenirs, for jeans, records, and chewing gum. It was like watching people who had been starved of color suddenly discovering a rainbow, observed a Finnish participant. The Soviet youth weren't just interested in the material items themselves. They were consuming the imagery, the packaging, the whole aesthetic experience of Western consumer culture. The festival marked a turning point in Soviet authorities' understanding of the challenge they faced. It was becoming clear that restrictions alone could not prevent the allure of Western consumer culture from penetrating Soviet society. If socialism was to compete, it would need to develop its own compelling vision of material prosperity and modern living. Under Alexei Kosygin, who became premier in 1964, the Soviet Union embarked on economic reforms that gave factory managers more autonomy and introduced limited market mechanisms. These reforms explicitly acknowledged the importance of consumer satisfaction and product quality, concepts that had been secondary under traditional Soviet planning. This shift necessitated a more sophisticated approach to advertising and marketing. By the late 1960s, the Soviet Union had established specialized advertising agencies like Vneshtorgreklama for international trade and Rozreklama for domestic products. While still operating within ideological constraints, these agencies began developing more visually appealing campaigns for Soviet goods. A 1969 advertisement for the Volga automobile, for instance, showed the car against a backdrop of modern Soviet architecture, with a well-dressed family loading luggage into the trunk. The image conveyed not just the car's utility, but an aspirational Soviet lifestyle, comfortable, modern, and family-oriented. The accompanying text emphasized the car's technical specifications, but also hinted at status, the choice of discerning drivers. Similarly, advertisements for Soviet cameras, televisions, and home appliances began incorporating more sophisticated design elements and lifestyle imagery. A 1970 campaign for the Start television set featured a family gathered in a modern apartment, watching a cultural program, combining the technical promise of Soviet electronics with the social vision of cultured, collective consumption. This evolution reflected a growing recognition that even socialist consumption needed emotional and aesthetic dimensions. As Soviet marketing specialist Viktor Komarovsky argued in a 1971 article, while rejecting the manipulation of bourgeois advertising, we must acknowledge that socialist products should provide not just utility but joy and satisfaction. The presentation of our goods should reflect their quality and the pride of their producers. Yet, this more nuanced approach to consumer communication faced significant obstacles. The fundamental economic structures of the Soviet system, centralized planning, production targets set by bureaucrats rather than market demand, chronic shortages of consumer goods, limited the effectiveness of any advertising strategy. What purpose did attractive packaging or compelling advertisements serve when store shelves remained half empty? How could marketing create brand loyalty when consumers had little choice between products? These contradictions became increasingly apparent to Soviet citizens, contributing to a growing cynicism about official promises of abundance. By the early 1970s, a profound psychological shift was occurring among many Soviets. The material gap between socialist promises and socialist reality was becoming undeniable. While exposure to Western consumer culture, through cultural exchanges, international sporting events, and increasingly accessible foreign broadcasts, provided a tantalizing alternative vision. For the Soviet leadership, this represented a crisis of legitimacy. The revolution had promised a higher form of civilization than capitalism, not just greater equality, but eventually greater abundance. As that promise seemed increasingly remote, the system's ideological foundations began to erode. "We pretend to work, and they pretend to pay us," went another popular Soviet joke, capturing the mutual disillusionment between citizens and the state. The unspoken social contract, political compliance in exchange for security and improving living standards, was fraying. This dynamic created the conditions for what would later be called the era of stagnation under Leonid Brezhnev. With revolutionary fervor long faded and material promises unfulfilled, Soviet society settled into a pattern of resigned cynicism. Citizens went through the motions of socialist participation while privately pursuing whatever small comforts were available. The psychological impact of this dissonance is difficult to overstate. Soviet citizens lived in a system that officially rejected consumerism while increasingly measuring itself against Western living standards. They were taught to dismiss advertising as capitalist manipulation while becoming ever more aware of the attractive products it promoted. They participated in rituals celebrating socialist achievement while experiencing daily frustrations with basic services and goods. For many, this contradiction became particularly acute during international sporting events like the Olympics, when Soviet athletes competed directly against Americans and others from the capitalist world. Television coverage inevitably included glimpses of Western crowds, stadiums, and commercial sponsors, visual evidence of the material gap between the systems. The 1972 Summit Series in ice hockey between the USSR and Canada provided a particularly powerful example. While Soviet players dominated the early games, Canadian television coverage also showcased ordinary life in North America: suburban homes, well-stocked supermarkets, car-filled highways. For Soviet viewers, these background images often made a stronger impression than the games themselves. I remember watching the hockey matches and being more interested in the advertisements during breaks, recalled Sergei Lebedev, a Moscow engineer. There was something hypnotic about them: the colors, the music, the sense of abundance and choice. It made you wonder what life would be like in such a world. Similar dynamics played out during cultural exchanges. When American musicians like Duke Ellington, 1971, or Benny Goodman, 1962, toured the Soviet Union, they brought not just music but an entire aesthetic sensibility shaped by commercial culture. Their fashionable clothes, professional equipment, and relaxed demeanor conveyed a message about Western prosperity more potent than any explicit propaganda. The Soviet response to these influences evolved over time. Initially, authorities tried to shield citizens from Western commercial imagery, dismissing it as manipulative and decadent. But as exposure became inevitable, the strategy shifted toward reinterpretation, acknowledging the attractive surface of Western consumer culture while emphasizing its exploitative essence. A 1974 documentary film titled Behind the Neon Lights typified this approach. It juxtaposed glittering American advertisements with scenes of urban poverty, unemployment lines, and social unrest. The bright colors of capitalist advertising mask the dark reality of life for ordinary workers, the narrator explained. These images sell not just products but an illusion, a dream of prosperity that remains unattainable for millions. This critique contained elements of truth. The American advertising industry of the 1970s did present an idealized vision that obscured real social problems. Yet the Soviet alternative, truth without beauty, was proving equally problematic. Gray apartment blocks, utilitarian goods, and uninspiring propaganda offered material security but little joy or aesthetic satisfaction. By the mid-1970s, this tension had produced a peculiar phenomenon in Soviet consumer culture: a hunger for Western packaging even more than Western products themselves. Empty Marlboro boxes, Coca-Cola bottles, and shopping bags from Western department stores became prized possessions displayed in Soviet apartments as symbols of sophistication and connection to the outside world. My cousin worked as a cleaner in the Inn Tourist Hotel where foreign visitors stayed, remembered Natalia Ivanova, who grew up in Leningrad during this period. Sometimes she would bring home empty shampoo bottles or cosmetics containers left by American tourists. We didn't care about the products, they were used up, but the packaging was beautiful. I kept a Revlon lipstick tube on my dresser for years. This fetishization of Western commercial imagery reflected a deeper crisis in Soviet visual culture. The official aesthetic, socialist realism, had become formulaic and uninspiring, while state-produced consumer goods lacked the design innovation seen in the West. Western advertising, whatever its manipulative intent, offered a visual feast in comparison. The Soviet leadership recognized this problem. In 1976, the Ministry of Light Industry established a laboratory for packaging design, tasked with developing more attractive presentations for Soviet products. The initiative represented an implicit acknowledgement that aesthetic appeal mattered in consumer satisfaction, a concept long rejected as bourgeois superficiality. Around the same time, Soviet advertising began incorporating more sophisticated visual techniques. A 1977 campaign for the Electron television set featured dynamic photography, contemporary graphic design, and the slogan, "Clear Vision of Today's World," a phrase that worked on multiple levels, promising both technical quality and modern relevance. Similarly, advertisements for Soviet fashion began moving beyond utilitarian presentations to incorporate elements of lifestyle marketing. A 1978 campaign for Gum, Moscow's largest department store, showed stylishly dressed models against urban backdrops with the tagline, "Contemporary Style for Contemporary Life," a clear attempt to position Soviet fashion as modern and appealing rather than merely functional. These developments reflected a gradual softening of ideological orthodoxy regarding consumer culture. While still rejecting the excesses of Western materialism, Soviet authorities increasingly acknowledged that socialist consumption could include aesthetic pleasure, variety, and even limited forms of self-expression through consumer choices. This ideological evolution was particularly evident in the Soviet approach to youth culture. Having recognized the appeal of Western styles among young people, authorities began promoting socialist alternatives, Soviet rock bands, youth fashion, and recreational activities that incorporated modern aesthetics while maintaining acceptable content. The results were often awkward hybrids. Soviet jeans, produced under brand names like Super or Tren, mimicked Western styling, but used inferior materials and construction. Soviet rock groups performed under the supervision of state-approved cultural organizations, their rebellious impulses channeled into acceptable expressions. Youth magazines featured modern graphic design but conventional socialist messaging. These attempts at creating a competitive socialist consumer culture faced significant structural obstacles. The Soviet economic system, built around centralized planning and production targets, struggled to respond to changing consumer preferences or produce the variety of goods seen in market economies. The fundamental problem was that our system was designed to produce what planners thought people should want, not what they actually wanted, explained former Soviet economist Nikolai Shmelev in a 1989 interview. When consumer desires became more sophisticated, when people wanted not just a television, but a stylish television, not just clothing, but fashionable clothing, the system couldn't adapt quickly enough. This limitation became increasingly problematic as global consumer culture accelerated in the 1970s and 1980s. Western advertising and product development became more sophisticated, creating seasonal fashion cycles, product variations, and lifestyle branding that made Soviet offerings appear increasingly outdated and unappealing. The gap was particularly visible in emerging product categories like personal electronics. While Sony was revolutionizing portable music with the Walkman, introduced in 1979, Soviet factories were still struggling to produce reliable record players. Western advertisers were creating aspirational imagery around these products, young people enjoying music outdoors, executives working on the go, that contrasted sharply with Soviet reality. By the late 1970s, even loyal Soviet citizens were finding it difficult to deny the material gap between the systems. A significant psychological shift occurred. What had once been perceived as temporary difficulties on the path to communist abundance was increasingly recognized as a systemic failure to deliver on fundamental promises. This shift coincided with broader disillusionment about Soviet prospects. The 1979 invasion of Afghanistan, growing economic stagnation, and the visible aging of the Soviet leadership under Brezhnev all contributed to a sense that the system had lost its dynamism and vision. In this context, Western consumer imagery took on new significance. It no longer represented just material goods, but an entire alternative modernity, one characterized by innovation, youth, dynamism, and individual choice. These qualities seemed increasingly absent from Soviet life, which was characterized by conformity, shortages, and bureaucratic inertia. The psychological impact was profound, particularly among younger Soviets with no memory of earlier revolutionary idealism. As historian Alexei Yurchak has documented, many developed a complex relationship with the system, outwardly conforming while inwardly disengaging, creating private spaces of freedom through Western music, fashion, and cultural references. This phenomenon became known as internal emigration, a psychological withdrawal from official Soviet values while remaining physically within the system. Western consumer goods and imagery played a crucial role in this process, providing symbolic resources for alternative identities and communities. Blue jeans weren't just pants, they were a statement, explained former Soviet citizen Mikhail Shishkin. Wearing them meant you belonged to a different world, at least in your mind. The same with Western music, films, even the way you decorated your apartment. These things created an imaginary West inside Soviet reality. This imaginary West, constructed largely through commercial imagery and products, often bore little resemblance to the actual capitalist societies it supposedly represented. It was an idealized space of freedom, abundance, and self-expression, the mirror image of how official propaganda portrayed the exploitative, alienating West. Soviet authorities recognized the danger but struggled to develop effective countermeasures. Traditional propaganda depicting Western societies as riddled with poverty and exploitation rang increasingly hollow as more Soviets gained direct or indirect exposure to Western life. Attempts to create attractive socialist alternatives were hampered by economic limitations and ideological constraints. The contradictions became increasingly visible during the 1980 Moscow Olympics. Despite an American-led boycott over the Afghanistan invasion, the Games required significant interaction with international media, sponsors, and visitors. Soviet authorities made unprecedented concessions to Western commercial presence, allowing limited advertising by official Olympic sponsors like Coca-Cola. For ordinary Muscovites, the temporary proliferation of colorful logos, product displays, and service enhancements created a surreal environment, a glimpse of how their city might look in a different economic system. When these special arrangements disappeared after the Games concluded, the return to gray Soviet normality felt even more depressing by contrast. This pattern of temporary openings followed by retrenchment characterized the early 1980s. The death of Brezhnev in 1982 led to brief periods of leadership under Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, both elderly representatives of the established system. Neither offered compelling solutions to the growing disconnect between socialist promises and consumer reality. The ascension of Mikhail Gorbachev to leadership in 1985 marked a decisive turning point. At 54, he represented a younger generation of Soviet leaders who recognized the system's deep problems. His twin policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, aimed to revitalize socialism by incorporating elements of market mechanisms, technological modernization, and greater transparency. This reform agenda inevitably impacted Soviet approaches to advertising and consumer culture. Under Gorbachev, restrictions on commercial communication were significantly relaxed. The 1986 Law on Individual Labor Activity and the 1988 Law on Cooperatives created space for limited private enterprise, which naturally sought to promote its offerings through advertising. By 1987, the first independent advertising agencies were appearing in major Soviet cities. These pioneers, with names like Advertising Project or New Perspective, operated in a legal gray area, neither fully private nor state-controlled. Their early work reflected this ambiguous status, combining elements of Western commercial technique with traditional Soviet messaging. Simultaneously, joint ventures between Soviet enterprises and Western companies began introducing new forms of advertising to the Soviet landscape. The first McDonald's in Moscow, which opened in 1990 after years of negotiation, brought with it the full spectrum of Western marketing, colorful signage, promotional campaigns, branded packaging, and uniformed staff trained in customer service. For many Soviets, these developments created cognitive dissonance. After decades of being told that advertising represented capitalist manipulation, they were now encouraged to view it as a normal part of economic modernization. After years of stoic acceptance of limited consumer choices, they were suddenly addressed as discriminating customers whose preferences mattered. This rapid transformation was captured in a 1989 opinion survey conducted by the Soviet Institute of Sociological Research. When asked about their attitudes toward advertising, 47% of respondents expressed positive views, describing it as informative and necessary in a modern economy. Only 18% maintained the traditional Soviet position that advertising was wasteful or manipulative. The shift reflected more than changing policy. It revealed how deeply Western consumer imagery had already penetrated Soviet consciousness. Despite decades of official criticism, many Soviets had developed a fascination with advertising aesthetics and the consumer lifestyle they represented. This fascination became increasingly visible as glasnost reduced media censorship. By the late 1980s, Soviet television was broadcasting Western films and programs that included commercial imagery and product placement. Popular magazines began featuring articles about international fashion trends, consumer electronics, and lifestyle topics previously considered too bourgeois for Soviet audiences. Even official publications adopted elements of commercial visual language. A 1989 cover of Ogonyok, a leading Soviet magazine, featured a stylish young couple with the headline, "New Generation, New Values," an image that would not have looked out of place in Western lifestyle publications. The accompanying article discussed changing attitudes toward work, leisure, and material aspirations among young Soviets. These developments reflected a profound ideological transformation. The traditional Soviet position that socialism would ultimately produce greater material abundance than capitalism through rational planning had been quietly abandoned. Instead, reform-minded officials now suggested that socialism could incorporate market elements while maintaining social protections. This hybrid vision required a new approach to consumer communication. If citizens were to exercise greater choice in a more market-oriented system, they would need information about available products and services. Advertising was gradually reframed not as capitalist excess, but as necessary economic information, a view that would have been heretical just years earlier. The psychological impact of this rapid reversal was significant. Many Soviets, particularly older citizens who had internalized traditional values, experienced it as ideological whiplash. Having been taught to view commercial culture as symbolic of capitalism's moral bankruptcy, they were now told it represented modern efficiency and consumer responsiveness. For younger Soviets, however, the changes often seemed too slow and limited. By the late 1980s, many had developed sophisticated knowledge of Western brands, styles, and consumer trends through informal networks, samizdat, underground publications, and increasingly accessible international media. Official attempts to create socialist advertising often appeared clumsy and dated by comparison. This generational divide became increasingly visible in urban spaces. While official billboards still featured traditional Soviet imagery and messaging, youth-oriented venues like music clubs and cafes began displaying unauthorized Western commercial imagery, Coca-Cola logos, fashion advertisements torn from magazines, movie posters, as symbols of cosmopolitanism and modernity. The authorities' response to this unsanctioned visual culture was inconsistent. In some cases, displaying Western commercial imagery could still result in official reprimands or harassment. In others, authorities looked the other way, recognizing that enforcing traditional restrictions was becoming both impractical and counterproductive. This inconsistency reflected broader uncertainties about Soviet identity during the Gorbachev era. What exactly did it mean to be a modern socialist society? Could consumer satisfaction coexist with collective values? Was it possible to create a distinctively Soviet modernity that could compete with Western alternatives? These questions became increasingly urgent as economic conditions deteriorated. Despite Gorbachev's reforms, consumer shortages actually worsened in the late 1980s due to disruptions in traditional supply chains, resistance from bureaucratic interests, and rising expectations among citizens. The contrast between colorful advertisements, both Western and new Soviet versions, and empty store shelves created a new form of cognitive dissonance. Where earlier generations of Soviets had experienced shortages as normal, the reform era had promised improvement while delivering deterioration. This contradiction was particularly evident in the emerging commercial television advertising of the period. By 1990, Soviet television was broadcasting both imported commercials, as part of Western programming, and domestically produced advertisements for new cooperative businesses and joint ventures. These commercials often promised products and services that were available only in limited quantities or at prices beyond most citizens' reach. A 1990 advertisement for the Yunost electronics store in Moscow, for instance, showcased imported VCRs and stereo systems that cost several months' average salary and frequently sold out immediately upon arrival. Similarly, early advertisements for private restaurants and cafes promoted a dining experience that few could afford during a period of falling real incomes and rising inflation. The images of abundance and leisure in these commercials contrasted sharply with the daily reality of food shortages and economic anxiety. This disconnect fueled growing cynicism about the reform process itself. As one popular joke of the period went, "What is it called when you combine the worst aspects of socialism with the worst aspects of capitalism? Perestroika." By 1991, the contradiction had become unsustainable. Soviet citizens were increasingly exposed to Western consumer imagery through advertising, media, and direct contact, creating rising expectations that the system could not fulfill. Simultaneously, the ideological justifications for Soviet economic underperformance had been undermined by the leadership's own reforms and admissions. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in December 1991, the transition to market capitalism brought a flood of Western advertising into the post-Soviet space. Cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, once characterized by socialist imagery and monuments, were rapidly transformed by commercial billboards, shop signs, and brand logos. This visual transformation symbolized a broader social and economic revolution. Virtually overnight, citizens of the former Soviet Union were thrust into a world where commercial messaging was ubiquitous and consumer identity central to social status. The psychological impact was profound. People who had grown up in a society where advertising was minimal and ideologically suspect now found themselves bombarded with sophisticated marketing messages. Every surface, from billboards to buses, television screens to shopping bags, became a canvas for commercial communication. It was like someone suddenly turned up the volume and color saturation of life, recalled Elena Mikhailova, who lived in Moscow during the transition. In the Soviet period, our visual environment was controlled and limited, mostly political slogans, some cultural announcements, occasional simple product information. Suddenly, we were drowning in images designed to create desire, to make us feel inadequate without certain products. Western brands rushed into the newly opened market, bringing with them marketing techniques refined over decades of consumer capitalism. Companies like Coca-Cola, Marlboro, McDonald's, and Levi's launched massive advertising campaigns targeting Russian consumers, combining global imagery with local cultural references. A 1992 Coca-Cola billboard in Moscow, for instance, featured the iconic bottle against the backdrop of St. Basil's Cathedral with the slogan, "Always Welcome" in Russian, a direct appeal to national pride and hospitality traditions. Similarly, Marlboro advertisements incorporated elements of Russian literature and landscape, while maintaining the brand's global cowboy imagery. This influx of Western advertising coincided with a period of extreme economic dislocation. As state subsidies disappeared and inflation soared, many Russians experienced sharp declines in living standards. The juxtaposition of glossy advertisements for luxury goods with widespread economic hardship created cognitive dissonance more severe than anything experienced during the Soviet period. There was something almost cruel about it, observed sociologist Lev Gudkov in a 1994 interview. People who couldn't afford basic necessities were confronted daily with images of an unattainable consumer paradise. The advertisements seemed to be saying, "This is normal life in capitalism," while normal life for most Russians had become a struggle for survival. This dynamic contributed to the profound disillusionment many Russians experienced with market reforms. Having expected Western-style prosperity, they instead encountered Western-style advertising alongside post-Soviet economic collapse, a combination that seemed to embody the worst aspects of both systems. The psychological consequences varied across generations and social groups. Older Russians who had internalized Soviet values often experienced the commercial transformation as a form of cultural assault, a vulgar intrusion of materialistic values into a society previously organized around different principles. Everything became about buying and selling, lamented Viktor Alexeyev, a retired engineer interviewed in 1993. The billboards, the television, all telling us to want things, to define ourselves through possessions. We were taught that was the empty core of capitalism, and now we were expected to embrace it overnight. For younger Russians, however, Western commercial culture often represented freedom and modernity after decades of isolation. The very aspects that disturbed older generations, individual choice, self-expression through consumption, hedonistic imagery, appealed to youth raised on smuggled Western music and fashion magazines. This generational divide played out across the physical landscape. While older Russians often lamented the transformation of familiar spaces by commercial signage, younger citizens embraced new consumer environments like shopping malls, fast food restaurants, and nightclubs plastered with brand logos and advertisements. Moscow's Tverskaya Street exemplified this transformation. Once lined with austere government buildings and the occasional utilitarian Soviet shop sign, by 1993 it featured illuminated displays for international luxury brands, massive billboards, and neon-lit storefronts. The street had morphed from a symbol of Soviet power to a showcase of international capitalism in less than 2 years. For many visitors from the former Soviet republics, these transformations in Russia's major cities created a surreal contrast with their home environments, where the transition to market economics often progressed more slowly. A Lithuanian journalist visiting Moscow in 1993 described it as time travel, moving from our still Soviet visual landscape to this explosion of commercial imagery. The rapid commercialization affected not just public spaces, but cultural institutions previously insulated from market pressures. Theaters, museums, and concert halls, once supported entirely by state funding, now featured corporate sponsorship banners and product displays in their lobbies. The Bolshoi Theater, a symbol of high Soviet culture, displayed Coca-Cola advertisements during the 1994-1995 season. This commercialization of cultural space represented a profound shift in values. Where Soviet ideology had emphasized culture as a public good accessible to all citizens, the market transition introduced notions of exclusivity, luxury experiences, and cultural consumption as status markers. Advertising played a crucial role in this transformation, not just promoting specific products, but reshaping social attitudes and aspirations. Early post-Soviet advertisements rarely focused on product features or rational benefits. Instead, they sold Western lifestyle imagery, glamour, sophistication, individualism, and success defined through consumption. A 1993 campaign for the Russian bank Imperial captured this approach perfectly. The television advertisements featured famous Russian historical figures like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great in luxurious settings, with the slogan, "We value traditions, the tradition of being first." The campaign made no mention of specific banking services. Instead, it associated the brand with imperial power, historical greatness, and elite status. Similarly, advertisements for imported cigarettes, alcohol, and fashion items emphasized sophisticated Western lifestyles rather than product attributes. A 1994 campaign for Kent cigarettes showed elegant parties in international settings with the tagline, "The International Standard of Quality," suggesting that consuming the product would connect Russians to a cosmopolitan elite. These aspirational messages found receptive audiences among the emerging Russian business class and urban professionals, who used Western brands as status markers in the new social hierarchy. Foreign cigarettes, imported alcohol, and international fashion labels became visible symbols of success in a society undergoing rapid stratification. The brand of cigarette you smoked or vodka you drank became a social signal, explained cultural analyst Mikhail Yampolsky. In Soviet times, access to scarce goods showed your connections. In the early post-Soviet period, displaying Western brands showed your financial success and cultural sophistication. This dynamic created a two-tier consumer society, a small segment with access to the Western goods advertised everywhere, and a much larger population that could only window shop. The visual saturation of advertising meant that even those who couldn't afford the products were constantly reminded of their exclusion from the consumer paradise promised by capitalism. Researchers documented psychological impacts similar to those observed decades earlier when Soviet visitors first encountered Western consumer society. Many Russians reported feelings of inadequacy, envy, and status anxiety, triggered by constant exposure to advertisements for unattainable goods. A 1995 study by the Russian Academy of Sciences found that 62% of Moscow residents reported feelings of personal failure related to their inability to consume at the level shown in advertisements. Young people were particularly affected, with many describing pressure to obtain status brands despite limited financial resources. This pressure contributed to social phenomena like the New Russians, nouveau riche businessmen, who engaged in conspicuous consumption of luxury Western goods, often portrayed as vulgar and uncultured in popular media. These figures nevertheless embodied the new value system in which wealth and consumption had replaced ideological correctness as measures of success. Their conspicuous displays, Mercedes cars, Rolex watches, designer clothes with visible logos, represented an extreme version of the consumer identity promoted by Western advertising. Having been denied consumer self-expression for generations, some embraced it with a vengeance once restrictions disappeared. Meanwhile, domestic Russian companies struggled to compete in this new environment. Few had experience with marketing or brand development after decades of operating in a planned economy where such activities were unnecessary. Their early advertising attempts often mimicked Western approaches without the same production quality or strategic sophistication. This disadvantage was particularly evident in television advertising, where low-budget Russian commercials appeared alongside glossy international campaigns. A 1994 advertisement for the Russian shampoo brand Chesney looked amateur compared to the cinematic production values of competing Pantene commercials, reinforcing perceptions that domestic products were inferior. By the mid-1990s, however, Russian advertising began developing its own distinctive approach. Rather than simply imitating Western techniques, agencies started incorporating uniquely Russian cultural references, humor, and psychological insights. Campaigns acknowledged the economic realities facing most consumers while still offering aspirational messaging. A 1996 campaign for Slavutich beer exemplified this evolution. Rather than presenting unattainable luxury scenarios, the advertisements showed ordinary Russians enjoying simple pleasures with friends, backyard barbecues, fishing trips, modest celebrations. The tagline, "Our Beer, Our People," directly addressed national identity and pride during a period of uncertainty. Similarly, advertisements for domestic food products increasingly emphasized traditional Russian recipes, local ingredients, and cultural authenticity, values that imported brands couldn't credibly claim. Brands like Domashny, Homestyle, dairy products, and Babushkina Krinka, grandmother's well, intentionally evoke nostalgia for pre-Soviet rural traditions rather than Western modernity. This strategic shift recognized a growing consumer backlash against the perceived foreign domination of Russian markets and culture. By the late 1990s, many Russians had developed more nuanced attitudes toward advertising and consumption, maintaining interest in Western goods while becoming more critical of marketing messages. Public opinion research from this period showed increasing skepticism toward advertising claims. A 1997 survey found that 73% of Russians believed most advertising is dishonest, while 68% reported they had learned to ignore most advertisements. These figures were significantly higher than comparable measures in Western countries with longer experiences of consumer capitalism. This skepticism partly reflected the gap between advertising promises and post-Soviet economic realities. After experiencing the contrast between marketing imagery and actual living conditions, many Russians developed what sociologists called a dual consciousness, simultaneously participating in consumer culture while maintaining ironic distance from its messages. The Russian advertising industry responded by developing more self-aware, humorous campaigns that acknowledged this skepticism. A 1998 advertisement for MTS Mobile Services featured the slogan, "We're not promising the moon, just reliable connections," directly addressing consumer weariness with exaggerated marketing claims. By the late 1990s, the visual landscape of major Russian cities had evolved beyond the chaotic commercialization of the early transition period. As regulations developed and municipal authorities gained more control, billboard placements became more orderly, signage more integrated with urban aesthetics, and the overall visual environment less overwhelming. Moscow's 1999 Clean City Initiative, for instance, removed thousands of unauthorized advertisements and established stricter standards for outdoor marketing. Similar efforts in Saint Petersburg aimed to protect historic architecture from visual clutter while still accommodating commercial needs. These developments reflected a broader normalization of consumer culture in post-Soviet society. The initial shock of commercial imagery had faded, replaced by more sophisticated engagement with advertising as part of everyday life. Russians had developed filtering mechanisms, critical reading skills, and selective attention that allowed them to navigate the commercial environment without being overwhelmed. This adaptation process mirrored what Soviet visitors to America had experienced decades earlier, initial sensory overload followed by gradual acclimatization. The difference, of course, was that post-Soviet citizens didn't return home to a non-commercial environment. Instead, they watched their entire society transform around them. For many who had lived through both systems, this transformation prompted complex reflections on values, identity, and social organization. Neither the anti-consumerist Soviet ideology nor uncritical embrace of Western materialism seemed adequate to the challenges of modern life. "We've gone from one extreme to another," observed film director Nikita Mikhalkov in a 1999 interview. "From a society that denied legitimate consumer desires to one where consumption seems to be the only value. There must be a middle path that preserves our cultural depth while allowing material progress." This search for balance characterized many post-Soviet societies as they entered the 21st century. Having experienced both the limitations of Soviet asceticism and the excesses of early capitalist commercialization, they began developing hybrid consumer cultures that combined elements of Western marketing with local traditions and values. The visual landscape reflected this evolution. By 2000, Russian cities featured sophisticated advertising that incorporated both global commercial techniques and, distinctly, Russian cultural references. International brands had learned to localize their messaging, while domestic companies had developed more professional marketing approaches. A 2001 advertisement for Beeline Mobile Services captured this synthesis perfectly. The campaign used globally influenced design standards with bright colors and dynamic imagery, but featured specifically Russian humor and cultural situations. The tagline, "Living on the Bright Side," worked in both global and local contexts. This visual maturation paralleled broader societal developments. As Russia's economy stabilized following the 1998 financial crisis, consumer markets developed greater depth and sophistication. The extreme stratification of the early transition period gradually moderated, with more Russians gaining access to a wider range of goods and services. The psychological relationship with advertising evolved accordingly. Where early post-Soviet advertisements had often triggered feelings of exclusion and inadequacy, maturing markets allowed more consumers to participate in the experiences being advertised, reducing the cognitive dissonance between marketing imagery and daily reality. For younger Russians with no personal memory of the Soviet period, commercial culture simply represented normality. Born into a world of advertisements and brand choices, they navigated consumer society with native fluency, developing the same mixture of engagement and skepticism found among their Western counterparts. Yet traces of the Soviet experience remained in older generations' consumer attitudes. Research consistently showed that Russians who had lived under socialism maintained distinctive shopping behaviors, greater price sensitivity, preference for functional product information over emotional appeals, and skepticism toward luxury positioning. These generational differences created interesting dynamics in Russian advertising. Campaigns often needed to address multiple consumer mindsets simultaneously, appealing to younger consumers' global orientation while respecting older consumers' practical focus and local values. The historical arc from Soviet shock at American advertising to Russia's development of its own commercial visual culture represents one of the most dramatic cultural transformations of the modern era. In less than 50 years, Russian society moved from ideological rejection of consumer culture to sophisticated participation in global marketing communications. This transformation reveals important insights about the psychological power of commercial imagery and its relationship to political systems. The Soviet authorities had correctly recognized that advertising represented more than mere product information. It visualized an entire worldview based on individual choice, material aspiration, and consumer identity. Their attempts to insulate citizens from these messages ultimately failed, not just because of increasing global connections, but because the visual promise of abundance and variety held genuine appeal. Commercial imagery spoke to real human desires for both material comfort and aesthetic pleasure, desires that socialist production struggled to satisfy. Yet the post-Soviet experience also revealed the limitations of consumer culture as a foundation for social organization. The psychological costs of unattainable marketing imagery, the social stratification exacerbated by status consumption, and the commercialization of previously public spaces all demonstrated that unfettered market mechanisms created their own contradictions. Today, Russians navigate a visual landscape that would be unrecognizable to Soviet citizens of the 1950s. Digital billboards, sponsored content, social media marketing, and e-commerce have created even more sophisticated commercial environments than those that once shocked Soviet visitors to America. Yet elements of that original cultural confrontation persist in contemporary Russian attitudes toward advertising and consumption. A distinctly Russian consumer culture has emerged that combines global marketing techniques with local psychological patterns, historical experiences, and cultural values. This hybrid identity, neither Soviet nor Western, reflects the complex legacy of a society that has experienced multiple economic systems within living memory. Unlike Western consumers whose relationship with advertising developed gradually over generations, Russians experienced commercial culture